A young woman left home and stopped answering her phone, so her parents went to the police. Detectives quickly started turning up one alarming lead after another, and it didn't take long before a pretty grim picture began to emerge. And once they uncovered the full truth, the case made national headlines because its details shook people to their core. Megan Newborough was born in August 1997 in a small British town called Nuneaton, not far from Birmingham. She grew up in a big, close-knit family. She had an older sister and a younger brother. When she was just 2, her parents signed her up for dance classes, and from that point on, dancing became one of the biggest parts of her life. She also adored animals, and she was always begging her parents to let her have pets like hamsters, dogs, and even rabbits. Megan had a tight group of friends from an early age, and they all said the same thing about her. She was genuinely kind, knew how to show up for people when things got tough, and she had this way of really understanding what someone else was going through. After school, she studied at a local college, then landed a job in HR at a large brick manufacturing company. She settled in quickly, won over her coworkers, and started making plans for the future. The summer of 2021 was a big moment for her. Megan was 23, and she'd already managed to buy her first place. She was supposed to get the keys just a few days before her birthday, and she couldn't wait to move in with her dog. Until then, she was still living with her parents in her hometown. On August 6th, at around 7:30 in the evening, she told her mom she was going out to meet someone for a walk, got into her car, and drove off. Her parents expected her back within a couple of hours, but by 9:30, she still wasn't home. They texted her, then tried calling, but Megan didn't answer. She wasn't responding on social media either, and they started to worry. Still, Megan was almost 24 and very independent, so they decided to wait until morning. They figured she might have stayed over at someone's place or gone somewhere with friends, but she never got in touch. And by morning, her parents decided to call the police. Megan's older sister told officers that the night before, Megan had been planning to meet up with her boyfriend, a 30-year-old man named Ross. They'd met at work a few years earlier, but they'd only started dating recently. Her sister said Megan described him as kind, caring, and a genuinely decent guy, and that the relationship was going great. Police went to speak with him, while other officers started tracking Megan's car using an automatic license plate reader system. They quickly saw that at 9:30 p.m., about 2 hours after she'd left home, her car had been spotted on camera in a nearby town, roughly a 40-minute drive away. But that still didn't answer the big question. Why hadn't she come home? When officers arrived at Ross' house in Colville, they found his parents there, but Ross himself wasn't home. His mom and dad said he'd gone to a nearby town to visit a local bar, so officers called him. Ross told them Megan had come over to his place the night before and stayed for about an hour while his parents were out. Then, he said, she headed home, telling him she was going to stop at McDonald's on the way for a milkshake. Ross also said he'd been trying to reach her all day, but she wasn't responding. According to him, he'd texted her a few times the night before and got nothing back. He assumed she'd made it home and fallen asleep, but when she still hadn't replied the next day, he kept messaging her. Given that police had called Ross while they were literally standing inside his house, and his parents agreed to let them look around, officers decided to do a quick walkthrough and see if anything felt off. When they stepped into the living room, they saw it was a mess. It was stuff scattered across the floor, and a large damp stain soaking into the carpet. Ross's parents said he'd spilled coffee there, but they admitted they hadn't actually seen it happen since they hadn't been home the night before. As they moved further in, officers spotted red stains along the baseboard in the hallway that looked like blood, so they called in forensic techs to collect samples and send them to the lab. Soon enough, the results came back. The red marks on the baseboard were Megan's blood. So, later that night, police returned to Ross's parents' house and arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping. Ross stayed oddly calm. He even asked if he could put on socks before they took him to the station. As they were cuffing him, one officer asked straight up where Megan was. Ross barely whispered, "Can we talk about this at the station?" But the officer pushed back. Even a whispered answer would do. He could tell Ross didn't want his parents to hear, so he kept his tone friendly, trying not to scare off what sounded like a possible confession. Ross leaned in and murmured, "She's in Woodhouse Eaves." It was a tiny village near the same town where he'd been sitting in a bar earlier that day. Then, he got more specific and named a rural road just outside the village. The officer then asked if she was okay, but Ross quietly said, no. He also added one more thing. Ross said he'd been planning to call police himself the next morning. While detectives drove Ross to the station, their colleagues headed straight to the area he'd named, searching the road with K9 units. It was already the middle of the night, and the stretch of road ran for miles, but they weren't about to waste a second. Before long, they also called in a helicopter, and the crew started scanning from above, trying to spot Megan. Not long after that, officers noticed a small patch of flattened grass a few yards off the road, near a low stone wall, so they walked over to take a closer look. When one of them shined a flashlight over the wall, he saw a woman's body. Part of her clothing was missing, and there were clear injuries around her neck. They immediately knew it was Megan. Medical examiners later came to a chilling conclusion. Megan died from strangulation, and only after she was already dead did the killer stab her in the neck 14 times. Meanwhile, police located Megan's car. It had been abandoned in the parking lot of a college in a nearby town. Forensics found Megan's blood on the front passenger seat, and nearby they recovered a glove that contained Ross' DNA. On top of that, investigators requested location data from Megan's phone and learned something else. Since the night she vanished, it had been sitting in a field not far from Ross' home. And because the phone was still on when it was left there, the data was precise enough for officers to go right to it and find it in the grass. When they examined the phone, they also found Megan's messages with Ross. The text showed that on the night she disappeared, she indeed drove to his house. After the murder, Ross started messaging her and leaving voice messages, acting like he was worried she wasn't responding. The next day, with Megan's body already lying out in that field, he kept texting her, pretending he had no idea where she'd gone. By lining those messages up with the car's movements on surveillance cameras, police were able to piece together what happened in the hours after the murder. Ross, who didn't have his own car or even a driver's license, had been driving Megan's car around the area with her body sitting in the front passenger seat, dumping evidence along the way. That trail led investigators to security footage near a fitness center. It showed Ross pulling into the lot, getting out, and tossing various items into a trash can. One camera even caught him changing clothes right there by the car, stuffing what he'd been wearing into a bag and throwing that bag in the bin too. After that, he didn't get back into the car at all. He just left it there and took a taxi home. Police immediately collected everything from those trash containers, and inside they found blood-stained clothing belonging to Megan, rags with blood on them, her glasses, and Ross' own clothes as well. At that point, investigators had a pretty solid working timeline. Megan likely arrived at his place around 9 p.m., and about 40 minutes later, he strangled her, then stabbed her in the neck over and over, and started trying to cover his tracks. But there was still one key piece missing. Motive. That changed pretty quickly. Even before a detective sat Ross down for a formal interview, they went back through his earlier messages with Megan. In those texts, Ross admitted he struggled with erectile dysfunction, and he said he blamed it on the ADHD medication he had to take. Megan didn't pull away from him. Instead, she told him she'd support him. A few weeks later, Ross started talking about wanting to try being intimate with her, but based on their messages, it didn't work. And after that, his texts started getting more and more angry and aggressive, while Megan kept trying to calm him down and reassure him. Detectives also searched his computer, and that only added to the pile of evidence. At around 11 p.m., basically right after he got home from dumping Megan's body, Ross Googled, "How to tell a girl you love her." Minutes later, he left Megan a voice message saying he was worried and didn't understand why she wasn't answering. Then, things took an even darker turn. Right after recording that message, Ross started looking up articles about 3 well-known killers. He opened multiple pages about Levi Belfield, who murdered at least 3 women, then read about Ian Huntley, responsible for 2 murders, and after that, he pulled up several articles about Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. After that, his phone and computer went quiet until the next morning. But at around 6:30 a.m., he was back at it, searching articles about serial killers again, while also visiting an adult site and watching videos focused on violence and humiliation. When he was done, he texted Megan, "Morning, babe." Not long after that, he started Googling the safest prisons in Britain, who cuts inmates' hair, and other questions about what life in prison is like. So, in a short window of time, investigators had built a pretty overwhelming picture of what Ross had been doing and what likely happened to Megan. But they still needed to interview him, and the story he told didn't match the narrative detectives had worked out. From the beginning, Ross didn't deny killing her. He admitted it, but he claimed it happened during an argument and that he lost control. He said he strangled Megan, then went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her in the neck over and over. As for what set him off, Ross gave detectives his explanation. He said that years earlier he'd been abused, and that it had affected him ever since. That night, when they tried to be intimate, he claimed it triggered flashbacks of that trauma, and he snapped. He also told them that at the start of that breakdown he'd managed to pull away from Megan, but that she tried to comfort him and came closer. That's when he said he attacked and killed her. Still, investigators didn't buy some crucial parts of Ross' story. To them, it looked like he was trying to steer this toward a manslaughter, something with a much lighter sentence. What they believed actually set him off was much simpler. He couldn't have sex with her again. Detectives learned that not long before the murder, Ross had ordered erectile dysfunction pills online. He was likely hoping they'd fix the problem, but it still didn't work. And in the investigators' eyes, that mix of anger and embarrassment is what pushed him over the edge. Ross also admitted Megan was one of the very few people he'd ever told about his condition. Investigators thought he may have been terrified she'd tell someone else, even though, by all accounts, Megan had only ever been supportive and understanding. And then, there were Ross' searches right after the killing. Detectives believed he had an unhealthy obsession with serial killers, sexual depravity, and violence, and that he wasn't just panicking after the murder. He was indulging something. In their view, he got real gratification from the idea of committing a brutal crime, and with his impotence issues, that may have been the only thing that made him feel in control. Finally, investigators pointed to how hard he tried to cover it up, and the fact that he only admitted to killing Megan after he was arrested. He didn't just dump her body and get rid of evidence, he also kept texting her, trying to make it look like he had no idea where she'd gone. He just didn't think through the basics. Ross likely didn't expect to be caught on multiple security cameras tossing blood-stained items and driving Megan's car around. He also didn't think to power off her phone before he ditched it in a field, which is exactly why police were able to locate it. And he probably didn't realize detectives could pull his browser history and see the serial killer searches and the violent adult content he'd been watching. But, despite all of that, Ross kept pushing the same line. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was a loss of control. So, the case went to court. Ross' lawyer tried to convince the jury that it all came down to an uncontrollable burst of rage, triggered by Ross' past trauma, along with his struggles with depression and anxiety. He even went into the trauma in detail, saying Ross had been abused by a man named Stephen Beedman, who in 2016 was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before parole for a different crime. Beedman and a friend had kidnapped and killed a young woman, but he didn't spend long behind bars and later died of a heart attack. The case became one of the most infamous in the UK, and it's been covered in several major documentaries. Still, none of that convinced the jury that Ross was being truthful and the prosecution's version of events felt far more solid to them. The trial wrapped up in December 2022, and it took the jury just an hour and a half to reach a verdict. Ross was found guilty of murder and was given a life sentence, with the chance of parole no earlier than 23 years. Not long after sentencing, the Attorney General's office asked the court to increase Ross's minimum term. They argued that, in their view, the crime had a sexualized element, given Ross's fixation on serial killers and violent adult materials. But the Court of Appeal rejected that request, saying there wasn't convincing evidence of a sexual motive or sexual context in what happened. So the sentence stayed the same, and Ross could be eligible for release when he's in his early 50s. It's also worth noting that during the trial, Ross repeatedly broke down in tears, but Megan's family didn't believe it was genuine. In their eyes, he never showed real remorse and kept clinging to his own version of the story. After Megan's death, her parents founded a nonprofit in her memory. The goal is to support initiatives that protect women from violence, and they also donate part of the money to a dog welfare charity because Megan absolutely loved dogs. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A college student headed to her friend's party and vanished without a trace. Police jumped on the case and started turning up one chilling clue after another. But, as days turned into weeks, every promising lead fell apart. That's how it stayed for 12 years, until detectives finally learned the truth. And the way it surfaced surprised everyone. Stephanie Hummer was born on August 4, 1975, in Cincinnati, Ohio. She grew up with loving parents and two younger brothers she'd been helping to look after since she was little. In school, Stephanie really stood out, not just for straight A grades, but for how involved she was in everything. She was on the soccer and softball teams, played violin, and she genuinely loved classical music. She also got into golf, just like her dad, and even spent a few years working as a caddy at a local course. Between that experience and her academics, she earned the Evans Scholarship, also known as the Chick Evans Caddy Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships in the country, the kind that covered full tuition at top schools. In 1993, when she was 18, Stephanie enrolled at Ohio State University to study landscape architecture. She slipped right into campus life, found new friends, and kept pulling excellent grades. On March 5, 1994, as Stephanie's freshman year was winding down, her parents came to visit. Her younger brother had made the finals of a math competition being held in the city, so the whole family was there to support him. Two of her best friends from back home had come, too, and that evening they were hanging out in her dorm, talking, laughing, just happy to be together. When, around midnight, two students stopped by. They were also from Cincinnati, guys they'd gone to the same high school with. Closer to 3 in the morning, the guys invited them to a party over at their dorm, about a 15-minute walk away, so everyone headed out. But, halfway there, one of the guys tried to cut through by climbing a fence and, in the dark, didn't see a sharp metal rod. He tore up his arm pretty badly, and the two of them decided to sprint back to their building to get it bandaged as fast as possible, leaving the girls on their own. At that point, Stephanie's friends figured they'd skip the party. It was late, and they had to head home in the morning. But Stephanie still wanted to drop by for a bit. Since the girls were staying in her dorm, she offered to walk them back. And even though they said they knew the way and could make it on their own, Stephanie insisted, walked them back to the building, said goodbye, and then turned around to go to the party. The dorms sat right next to campus, and the area had a pretty safe reputation. Students were out there day and night, and parties were always happening, so Stephanie wasn't worried about being out that late. She knew these streets well, she'd walked them plenty of times, and it just didn't occur to her that anything could go wrong. When her friends woke up the next morning, Stephanie still hadn't come back to the dorm. And at first, they didn't think much of it. Maybe the party ran late, or she'd crashed at the guy's dorm and would be back soon. But time kept ticking, and there was still no sign of her. The girls, who were supposed to head home that day, started to worry, because even if Stephanie had stayed over at that other dorm, she should have been back hours ago to say goodbye. By late morning, close to noon, their worry hit a breaking point, and they went to campus police. Officers reached out to Stephanie's parents, who had already left the city, and told them their daughter was missing. Her father immediately called the Columbus Police Department and they took a missing person report. As soon as officers started working the case, they heard from colleagues about a call that had come in just a few hours earlier. Around 10 in the morning, a railroad worker rolling slowly along the tracks about 4 miles from campus noticed something in the brush. He stopped to take a closer look, thinking at first it was a mannequin, but then realized he was looking at a young woman's body. He put it out over the radio and his coworkers called the police. When officers arrived, they found the victim almost completely undressed, only socks and shoes still on, with her bra looped around her neck. And there were no personal items anywhere nearby, which meant they had no way to ID her on the spot. The place where she was found had a lousy reputation, the kind of patch where dealers met buyers and sex workers turned up after dark. So the first thought was that the victim might be tied to that world. But detectives backed off that idea pretty quickly. One of them suggested she could be an Ohio State student, so they reached out to campus police. Soon, they learned Stephanie had been reported missing and got her father on the phone. He gave them a description, and detectives realized that the slain woman was most likely Stephanie. So her parents turned the car around, drove back to Columbus, and went to the morgue, where they confirmed the body was their daughter. Medical examiners determined she'd died from a blow to the head with an unknown heavy object. She'd also been sexually assaulted, and they collected a semen sample for DNA testing. The bruising on her neck looked like strangulation at first, but, on a closer look, it read more like hickeys. So they swabbed her neck for additional biological material and sent those samples to the lab along with the semen. They also put the time of death somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. Detectives spoke with Stephanie's friends, who walked them through what had happened that night, then went over to the dorm where the two guys who'd invited them to the party lived. Those guys said Stephanie never showed, and everyone else they interviewed backed it up. Investigators also asked whether either guy had been in an intimate relationship with Stephanie, since the marks on her neck didn't sit right and suggested the killer might have been someone she'd been with, that things might have started consensually and then turned when she tried to stop it. But both of them insisted Stephanie was just a friend. Detectives also noticed the bandage on one of their arms and thought it was suspicious. But he explained he'd cut himself on a fence and his friends confirmed it. And on top of that, both guys agreed to take polygraphs and provide DNA samples. So the cops crossed these guys off their list. But, soon enough, the case took a sharp turn. The lab compared the guy's DNA to the swab taken from the victim's neck and got a full match. It belonged to Thomas, the same guy who'd sliced his arm on the fence the night before. Detectives brought him right back in and laid the evidence on the table. Earlier, he'd insisted there was nothing romantic between him and Stephanie, but now he said they'd been making out that night. Which raised eyebrows, not just because he'd kept a pretty crucial detail to himself, but because everyone else who'd been in Stephanie's room swore they hadn't seen anything like that. Thomas said he'd just forgotten to mention it, claiming they'd kissed on the couch while the others were in the next room and that it hadn't gone any further, but detectives weren't buying it. They considered the possibility that he might have run into Stephanie later when she was walking across campus by herself. But then came another twist. The lab finished processing the semen collected from Stephanie's body, and it didn't match Thomas. It belonged to an unknown male who wasn't in the FBI's database, which is why detectives took Thomas off the suspect list, since the evidence pointed to someone else as the assailant. They also collected DNA from every student living in Thomas's dorm, but they didn't get a single match. Since his DNA didn't hit any database, detectives figured they might be dealing with someone on his first offense, and with what little they had, they started sketching out a timeline for that night. Because Stephanie's body was found about a 10-minute drive from her dorm, they believed the attacker struck her in the head with something heavy, loaded her into his car, and took her out to that quiet strip by the railroad tracks. In their view, he sexually assaulted her inside the car while she was unconscious, but at some point, Stephanie came to, and she may even have managed to get out and run, because the brush near where she was found was crushed down like someone had been fighting to push through it. She didn't get far, though, and he chased Stephanie down before killing her. Over the next few days, police canvassed students and people who lived in the area, hoping for anything that might break the case open, but nothing stuck. That's how it went for almost a month, until detectives finally got their first real lead. Their colleagues had arrested a man named Michael for trying to abduct a student from the same university, and investigators immediately asked the lab to compare his DNA. But to their surprise, Michael had nothing to do with Stephanie's murder. Not long after, a man came forward about his friend, a guy named Anton. According to him, a few days after the killing, Anton had asked if he could keep a very big secret, then told him that he'd been near campus the night Stephanie was killed. After that, Anton straight up confessed that he was the one who had kidnapped and murdered her. Detectives wired the friend's phone and asked him to call Anton so they could get it on tape. And not only did Anton repeat the confession, he dropped a detail that made detectives sit up. He mentioned the glow from a large TV tower you could see from the spot where the body was found. Right after that, Anton was brought in for questioning, and suddenly, he flipped the story, insisting he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed he'd heard about it on the news and was messing with his buddy. And as for the TV tower, he said he'd been out there before and just remembered the view. None of that did much to convince detectives he was innocent, but his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. So, despite all the red flags, they crossed him off the suspect list. Not long after, the FBI joined the case, and the whole investigation kicked up a level. Detectives had already logged several reports from locals who, on the night of the murder, saw a white van cruising their streets. And that thread suddenly started to look a lot more promising. Working through ex-cons who lived near the crime scene, they landed on a man named Rodney, who'd done time for kidnappings. Back when he was locked up, they weren't collecting inmate DNA yet, so he wasn't in the FBI database. He worked for a transport company with an office right by where Stephanie's body had been found, and the company used white vans, the same kind he could get his hands on, so detectives went to talk to his coworkers. One of them told them something that made their skin crawl. Rodney had bragged about a game he liked to play, where he'd drive a work van onto campus, walk up to female students, claim he was an undercover cop, and lure them into the van, where he'd start putting his hands on them. They also spoke with Rodney's ex-girlfriend and learned she lived near Stephanie's dorm. But there's more. She said they'd broken up shortly before the murder and he hadn't taken it well at all. He'd been acting scary and clearly unstable. That was enough for a warrant to search the van he'd been using, and inside, they found handcuffs, a flashlight, and a handgun that turned out to be stolen. Rodney was arrested and brought in, but he refused to answer any questions. Even so, detectives took his DNA and sent it to the lab. But when the results came back, they could hardly believe it. Despite everything pointing his way, his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body, which meant they had to cross him off the list, and just like that, they were back to nothing. From that point on, the case barely budged. Detectives kept chasing tips, and Stephanie's parents went to the media again and again, pleading with the public to come forward with anything that might help catch their daughter's killer. Almost 2 years later, police landed on a new suspect, a man arrested in California for murder and sexual assault. When investigators dug in, they learned that at the time Stephanie was killed, he'd been living near her dorm, but the DNA ruled him out. There were also several men who tried to take credit for Stephanie's murder, yet none of their DNA matched the attackers. They turned out to be inmates from the same prison, hoping to spin the case into a movie or a book deal. After that, nothing meaningful surfaced, and the investigation basically froze for years. That's how it stayed until 2005, when Ohio changed the law to collect DNA from all convicted felons. Before that, you could be stopped over and over, or even serve time for lesser offenses, and your DNA still wouldn't be in the system. Once samples were taken at booking, the database was flooded with new profiles. On January 17, 2006, a call came into Columbus PD. By then, the lead detective on Stephanie's case had retired and a new investigator had taken over. On the phone, he was told there'd just been a hit in the FBI database. A profile had been added that matched the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. It belonged to a Columbus resident named Jonathan Gravely. The investigator immediately rang his predecessor, who still hoped the case would break, and shared the news. In 12 years of work, police had never crossed his name. When they dug in, they found Jonathan lived just a 12-minute walk from campus. At the time of the murder, he was 24 and already had 2 children. And in the years since, he divorced, remarried, and had 2 more, while landing a well-paid job at a local manufacturing plant. They also learned he'd been arrested 17 times, mostly for drugs, alcohol, and DUI. But none of those cases had been serious enough back then to put his DNA into the system. That's how it went until 2006, when he got arrested yet again. But this time, the new law was in effect, so Jonathan's DNA went straight into the system. And the moment it landed there, it pinged a match to Stephanie's case. It's worth saying what actually put him in handcuffs and, in the end, tied him to a 12-year-old cold case. He'd skipped a child support payment, and his ex-wife called the police. 2 days after the hit, the new lead detective, together with the retired investigator who'd carried the case for years, showed up at Jonathan's workplace. The second they said they wanted to talk, he got visibly rattled, hands shaking, though he still agreed to come down to the station. When they told him about the DNA match, Jonathan said he had nothing to do with the murder. According to him, he met Stephanie at a bar that night, and they struck up a conversation. After a while, they decided to leave and find somewhere more private. So he drove her out away from downtown, and, he said, they had consensual sex. Detectives didn't buy it, not only because Stephanie was 18 and the drinking age was 21, but because it made no sense that she'd ditch a party with longtime friends to wander into a bar full of strangers in the middle of the night. When they told him they didn't believe him, Jonathan shifted his story, saying things started consensually, that Stephanie initiated it, but then she suddenly changed her mind and threatened to tell his wife. An argument broke out, he hit her, and after that, he claimed everything went blank. That version didn't convince detectives either, so they laid out their own. Stephanie was walking toward her friend's dorm to hit the party when Jonathan spotted her. He owned a white van at the time, and investigators believe he pulled up alongside her on a dark, empty street, maybe opened with something harmless, like asking for directions, just enough to lower her guard. From there, they think he hit her on the head, knocked her out, loaded her into the van, and drove to the spot where her body would later be found. While she was unconscious, he stripped and sexually assaulted her. But at some point, Stephanie came to and managed to get out. Jonathan chased her down, forced her to the ground, and kept striking her in the head until she died. Even though he wouldn't admit to the abduction, he did acknowledge that he killed her, so he was arrested and the case went to court. It's worth mentioning that the judge set his bail at $1 billion, which was basically a symbolic gesture. Jonathan's attorney immediately argued that the confession was obtained illegally, that his client hadn't agreed to be questioned without a lawyer present, so they wanted to have it thrown out. Jonathan's new fiancée took his side, too, insisting he'd never hurt anyone. She believed his version, that Stephanie had consensual sex with him, left afterward, and someone else killed her. In the end, prosecutors said they'd seek the death penalty, and that's when Jonathan took a deal. They'd take death off the table if he pleaded guilty, and he accepted this deal in September 2007. The plea didn't require him to lay out the details of what happened, only to admit guilt. But even so, Jonathan stood up and addressed Stephanie's family, offering an apology for their daughter's death. They didn't buy a word of it, not for a second, and said they hoped he'd get the maximum punishment. In the end, the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, and under that sentence, he became eligible to seek parole after just 16 years. His first request came in 2023, but the board turned him down. He's still behind bars, though he has a real shot at getting out in the not-too-distant future. Stephanie's father and the people closest to her say they'll fight that every time it comes up. Sadly, her mother passed away from cancer 8 years after the verdict. To honor Stephanie, her hometown opened a small park in her name, and to this day, her family and friends still go there to remember her. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A student headed home after a night out with friends, but she never made it. At first, detectives thought that this would be a pretty straightforward case, but what happened next shocked everyone. As disturbing new details came to light, the whole of Australia was outraged, and the public's anger is still very much alive. Audrey Griffin was born in 2005 in Australia. From the time she was a kid, she was all about sports, and not just for fun. She trained hard and took it seriously. Over the years, she racked up some impressive achievements, competing in triathlons, playing rugby and water polo, and showing up to tournaments ready to win. She even flew to New Zealand for a major triathlon and finished 23rd in her age group, out of hundreds of athletes. But Audrey wasn't just about competition. She had a big group of friends who loved being around her because she was full of energy, driven, and genuinely kind. After finishing high school, she got into the University of Technology in Sydney to study marine biology. And around that same time, she started thinking about joining the military. She wanted to serve her country and make a difference, and she had her sights set on the Navy. By the time she was finishing her second year, she made the decision to enlist. She was 19 at the time, and before heading off to start her service, she wanted to spend some time with her dad and her grandparents, who lived in a small town called Irina. She also had a bunch of friends there and figured it was the perfect time to say goodbye before starting this big new chapter of her life. On March 21, 2025, Audrey spent the day with her family and paid a visit to her grandfather, who was in the hospital at the time. The next day, she met up with friends at a bar in a nearby town. They'd organized a going-away party for her since she'd soon be heading off for military service and wouldn't get to see them for a long while. Audrey had a great time, and around 2 a.m., she decided to head home. At first, she tried to call a cab, but the app couldn't find a ride. So, she figured she'd start walking towards her dad's place, planning to make it to the main road that connected a few nearby towns and try to flag down a taxi there. Audrey said goodbye to her friends and headed out. About an hour later, they tried texting and calling her to make sure she got home safe, but she didn't answer. They started to worry, but told themselves she probably just made it back and went to bed. The next morning, Audrey's mom woke up and immediately checked her daughter's location using a smartphone app. She was in Sydney at the time, but she knew Audrey had been out late and just wanted to make sure she got home safely. But when she opened the app, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Audrey's phone was still showing as being near a river that ran through town, nowhere near her dad's house. Worried, she called Audrey's dad, who said she never came home that night. He added that Audrey had mentioned she might crash at a friend's place, so they called that friend next, but she hadn't seen her either. Realizing something was wrong, Audrey's friends called the police and headed to the river where her phone was last pinged. They walked along the shoreline and eventually came across her purse and a hair clip. Right around that same time, police officers arrived at the scene, along with Audrey's father. When they spotted her belongings, they kept searching the riverbank. Then, someone noticed something floating in the water, and as they got closer, it became heartbreakingly clear. It was Audrey. Police turned Audrey's body over to the medical examiner, and the initial conclusion was that she had drowned. Investigators believed it must have been some kind of tragic accident. Maybe she slipped and fell into the water in the dark and wasn't able to get out. Given how late it was and the fact that she'd been walking along a mostly deserted stretch of road, the theory seemed plausible to them. But Audrey's family and friends absolutely refused to believe that. Her mother said Audrey hadn't been drinking that night and the idea that she could drown in a shallow river just didn't make sense. Audrey had been swimming for years, even in the ocean with strong waves, and she never had any problems. And then there were a few more things that didn't sit right, like the marks under her fingernails and that her jacket had been torn. Despite all of that, police continued to treat Audrey's death as nothing more than a tragic accident. Over the next several days, her parents waited for some kind of update, or at least a sign that detectives were actively working the case. But nothing happened. Her death didn't even make the local news at first, and only a few media outlets picked up the story days later. Audrey's family and friends couldn't just sit around doing nothing. They kept returning to the river, hoping they'd spot something that might help explain what happened. 3 days after her death, a friend of Audrey's mom found her phone, half buried in the mud near a tree. It was just lying there, in plain sight. Her parents were furious. The fact that police hadn't even done a thorough search of the area made things feel even worse. After that, Audrey's mom decided to take matters into her own hands. She started visiting every business along the road where Audrey had walked that night. And surprisingly, not a single one of them had been contacted by police, not even for a routine interview. Unfortunately, none of them had any useful information to offer, so once again, Audrey's family was left with nothing. Weeks went by, and all that time, Audrey's family kept pushing the police to take the case seriously. Eventually, detectives agreed to open a full investigation, and on April 17th, almost a month after Audrey's death, something unexpected happened. Police put out a public request for help identifying a man who had been spotted on surveillance footage along Audrey's route that night. They clarified that he wasn't a suspect, at least not officially, but they wanted to speak with him as part of the investigation. The only problem was the footage was grainy and the man's face wasn't clearly visible, which made it hard to figure out who he was. For the next few days, there were no major updates from law enforcement. But that all changed on April 21st, when detectives suddenly announced they had made an arrest in connection with Audrey's case. They arrested a 53-year-old man named Adrian Torrens, who was found in Sydney. And that same day, he was officially charged with Audrey's murder. Once the arrest was made, police shared with the public what they had uncovered over the past few days. At first, they were leaning toward the idea that Audrey's death had been a tragic accident. But after mounting pressure from her family, detectives launched a deeper investigation. By reviewing CCTV footage along Audrey's route, they spotted a man walking several hundred yards behind her. Later, he appeared on another camera, still trailing her. Then, they spoke with a local resident who lived near the river. Around 3 a.m. that night, he heard a sharp, high-pitched scream that lasted for about a minute. At the time, he thought it might have been a wild fox, since their cries can sound eerily human. But after hearing about Audrey's death on the news and realizing the timing lined up, he began to suspect it might have actually been her. Then, police found another witness, a man who had been out walking his dog in the middle of the night. He said he had passed by some man who gave him a bad feeling. According to the witness, the guy looked really on edge, nervous and twitchy, and just came off as strange overall. When detectives got a description, they realized it matched the same man from the surveillance footage, right down to the clothes he was wearing. At that point, the theory that Audrey's death had been an accident started to fall apart. Investigators asked for a more detailed forensic analysis of her body, and that's when things really started to shift. This time, the medical examiner found multiple scratches on Audrey's arms, along with abrasions on her face that could have come from a blow. But the most important discovery was still to come. When they took samples from under her fingernails, they found skin tissue. DNA testing revealed it belonged to a man, and when they ran the sample through the criminal database, they got a hit almost instantly. The DNA matched Adrian Torrens. Based on everything they had at that point, police were now working with a completely different theory. The injuries on Audrey's body, along with Torrens' DNA under her fingernails, strongly suggested that she had fought him off and that he likely held her underwater until she lost consciousness. But even though the suspect was finally behind bars, Audrey's case was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning to gain national attention, and just a few days later, the entire country was talking about it. That's because after Torrens' arrest, disturbing details about his past came to light, and people across Australia were outraged. While Audrey's friends and loved ones were still reeling from the arrest, there was one person who wasn't surprised at all. Torrens' ex-wife, Michelle. When reporters reached out to her, Michelle said she'd been living in fear for months because Torrens had repeatedly threatened her life. The two had gotten married in 2020, and at first, he seemed like a kind, caring, and positive guy. But that changed quickly. Not long after the wedding, his behavior started to shift. According to Michelle, he would suddenly snap, flying into fits of rage and threatening her out of nowhere. It didn't take much to set him off, and she began to seriously fear that he might hurt her. By early 2024, Michelle realized she couldn't stay in the relationship any longer. That moment came when Torrens, in one of his rages, punched a hole in the wall, just inches from her face. That was the final straw. She left him and went to the police to get a restraining order. It was a full no-contact order, but within just a few weeks, Torrens had already broken it. He called her 34 times and left 24 voicemails, filled with threats, insults, and promises to kill her. He even said he was on his way to her house multiple times, so Michelle was terrified and living in constant fear. She went back to the police and they went to arrest Torrens, but for some reason, they couldn't find him for 5 whole months. And during that time, the messages and threats kept coming. That went on until January 2025, when police finally managed to track Torrens down and arrest him. It was then that Michelle learned something that left her stunned. Torrens had a long criminal history he'd never told her about. He'd been arrested for drunk driving, drug offenses, and a string of other charges. In 2019, he assaulted his girlfriend and was sentenced to 20 months in prison, but ended up only serving 4. After that, he kept racking up charges, theft, fraud, you name it. And yet, he somehow avoided any real consequences. When he was arrested in January for violating the restraining order, it looked like he might finally do time, but for some reason, the judge decided to go easy on him. Instead of sending him to jail, they gave him what was basically a slap on the wrist, a kind of probation where he was technically supposed to be supervised, but in reality, there were no real restrictions on his freedom. So, Torrens walked free, and just 3 months later, he murdered Audrey. Once that information became public, people across the country were furious. They couldn't understand how the court had let a man like that stay out of prison, essentially giving him the chance to kill a 19-year-old girl. And, to make matters worse, it took police nearly a month after Audrey's death to even start treating it as a possible homicide. Audrey's mother later revealed something else. After Torrens was arrested, one of her friends remembered seeing him at the river, at the exact spot where Audrey had died, just 5 days after the murder. He was wearing the same clothes seen in the surveillance footage from that night. But even that wasn't the end of it. Audrey's mother also said that police only began investigating after she demanded to see all the CCTV footage from her daughter's route. Only then did detectives decide to review it themselves and realize someone had been following Audrey that night. And when they finally did arrest Torrens, police managed to bungle that too. They sat down with Audrey's parents and told them that Torrens was likely the killer. Audrey's mom asked if he had done something to her daughter, and the detectives responded, "We haven't had a chance to talk to him yet, because he's asleep." As for Torrens, after his arrest, he refused to confess. But police had something close to a confession anyway. Before taking him in, they tapped his phone, and during a call with a friend, Torrens admitted to the murder. He said something inside him had just snapped, and that he had no idea why he did it. So, the prosecution had everything they needed for a conviction, but then, the case took one final unexpected turn. Just 3 days after his arrest, Torrens was found unconscious in his jail cell. He was rushed to the hospital, but didn't make it. According to early reports, he did it himself. The news hit Audrey's parents like a second tragedy. Not only had they wanted justice, they had also wanted answers. They needed to know why this man took their daughter away from them. But now, that answer died with him. Then again, based on what he told his friend, there may have never been a reason at all. Torrens was known to abuse alcohol and drugs, and he may have been completely out of his mind that night. His ex-wife, later said he started calling her again that same evening, threatening to kill her. And just like that, the case was effectively closed, though official procedures are still ongoing to this day. Audrey's story sparked widespread outrage across the country, and for good reason. Not only had the system repeatedly allowed a dangerous man to walk free, but police took nearly a month to even begin a proper investigation. The public was also furious because Audrey was the 23rd woman killed in Australia in 2025 alone. And, while such tragedies happen with alarming frequency, people were outraged by the government's continued failure to take real action to stop them. Some steps, however, have finally been taken. A resolution named in Audrey's memory was introduced in Parliament, calling for stronger measures to prevent similar crimes. The Prime Minister also launched an investigation into the police department that handled Audrey's case, as well as the jail where Torrens died. Memorial events were held across the country, with thousands of people coming together to honor Audrey's life. One of the most powerful moments took place at the river where her body was found. People gathered and waited for a sunset, because that was Audrey's favorite time of day. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A woman vanished from her own home, leaving behind a trail of strange messages. Police launched an investigation, but, for years, it led nowhere. Then, detectives took an unusual step, something straight out of a detective movie, and finally uncovered the shocking truth. Lisa Mitchell was born on August 5, 1983, in Calgary, Canada. From an early age, she had a real love for anything creative. When she was just 4, she got into drawing, and that passion stuck with her as she got older. In high school, she also discovered a love for music and even started a band with a few of her friends. After graduation, Lisa decided to hold off on college. She needed to work and support herself, so she bounced between a few part-time jobs. While working at a restaurant, she met a man named Alan. The two started dating, and a few years later, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Eventually, they moved into their own home in a quiet neighborhood and focused on raising their family. This went on until October 2012. On the 27th, Lisa, who was 29 at the time, headed to her evening shift at a hotel where she worked alongside her mom. That night, the hotel was hosting a Halloween-themed party, and Lisa and her mom had a great time working the event together. After her shift, Lisa decided to spend the night at her mom's place, since the drive back to her own house was pretty long. The next morning, they chatted about the party and talked over their plans for the week, when suddenly, Lisa's phone rang. After a quick call, she told her mom she had to head home right away. She said goodbye, got in her car, and left. Her mom thought it was a little odd, but didn't dwell on it at the time. However, over the next few days, that feeling of unease started to grow, because Lisa never called her back. And that just wasn't like her. Lisa usually checked in with her mom a few times a week, no matter what. Her mom tried calling, but Lisa didn't pick up. At first, she figured Lisa was probably just busy, but as the days passed and there was still no word, she started to feel like something wasn't right. Eventually, she decided to drive over to Lisa's house to make sure everything was okay, but Lisa wasn't there. Instead, she was met by Alan, who told her he had no idea where Lisa was either. According to him, the day after she left her mom's, October 28th, they had gotten into an argument. He said he went out to buy cigarettes, and when he came back, Lisa was gone. But something about that story didn't sit right with Lisa's mom. She couldn't imagine her daughter just leaving without saying a word, and especially abandoning her kids. Then she noticed something strange. While talking to Alan in the hallway, she saw Lisa's winter coat and boots still in the closet. And, since it was cold outside, there was no way Lisa would have gone anywhere without them. That's when she decided to look around the rest of the house. Inside, she found Lisa's favorite bracelet and necklace, the ones she always wore whenever she left home. Her purse, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. Before she left, Alan mentioned one more thing. He said Lisa had sent him an email and suggested her mom check her inbox, too. When she got home, she turned on the computer, and, sure enough, there was a message from Lisa. In it, Lisa said she was just feeling tired and needed to get away for a while. As strange as it all seemed, the messages that followed kept reassuring her that everything was okay. They kept exchanging emails over the next few weeks, but, no matter how many times her mom asked, Lisa never explained why she suddenly left or where she was. On November 16th, Lisa's mom woke up to find a missed call from her daughter. It had come in at 2:45 in the morning and went to voicemail. At first, she felt a wave of relief just hearing Lisa's voice. But as she listened to the actual message, that relief quickly turned into concern. Something about it felt off, and the more she replayed it, the less sense it seemed to make. Lisa said, "Hey, I'm okay. Sometimes my weeks get crazy, you know?" And it was quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden this happened, and within half a day I should, but he's back now, and I gotta go. Love you. None of it made any sense. Who was she talking about? What had happened? The message only raised more questions. That's when Lisa's mom realized she couldn't just wait around any longer. She decided it was time to go to the police. She told them everything that had been going on, and investigators started a search for Lisa. After speaking with her mom, they learned that Lisa and Alan's relationship had been rocky from the beginning. Even before their kids were born, the couple broke up and got back together more times than anyone could count. Things settled down a bit after they had children, but eventually, new problems started to surface. Lisa was frustrated that Alan had never managed to hold down a steady job. He bounced from one gig to another and sometimes didn't work at all. That left Lisa to support the family on her own, juggling 2 full-time jobs while also raising the kids. It all started to wear on her, and Lisa had begun thinking about ending the relationship. But in the end, she stayed for the sake of the children. When detectives brought Alan in for questioning, he admitted their relationship had been troubled. He said that in recent years, he and Lisa had agreed to stay together only for the sake of their kids. According to him, Lisa had been seeing other men from time to time, and he claimed he was fully aware of it. As for her disappearance, Alan said he had no idea where she might have gone. He added that he wasn't all that surprised she decided to leave, but what he couldn't understand was how she could just walk away and leave him alone with 2 kids. Police searched the house, but didn't find anything that pointed to what might have happened. But then, they checked Lisa's computer and found conversations with several men, which raised some eyebrows since those men lived in other cities. Investigators started to wonder if maybe Lisa had gone to stay with one of them. But when they contacted them, each of the men said the same thing. They hadn't seen Lisa. Police also tried to trace the email address that had been sending messages to Lisa's mom, as well as the phone number that left the voicemail. But neither led anywhere. Over the following months, investigators kept searching for new leads and pushed Lisa's story out to the media, but there was still no sign of her. Lisa's mom eventually stopped receiving emails, and, with each passing month, her hope of ever seeing her daughter again began to fade. Deep down, she suspected Alan might have had something to do with Lisa's disappearance, but every time she brought it up, police told her the same thing. There was no evidence linking him to the case. For Alan, he continued raising the kids on his own and eventually landed a steady job with decent pay. He met a man who was opening a new car dealership, and the guy offered him a full-time position. Later on, that man's girlfriend started babysitting Alan's kids from time to time, which made things a little easier for him. Eventually, Alan started thinking about dating again, and not long after, he actually got the chance. One day, as he was leaving work, a woman accidentally rear-ended his car. She'd lost control due to the weather and told him her company would cover the repairs. As a friendly gesture, she also gave him a pair of hockey tickets. They stayed in touch after that, and Alan started thinking about the possibility of building something more with her. This went on for about 2 years. It seemed like Alan was moving on with his life, and there were still no updates, no signs, and no messages from Lisa. In early December 2014, 2 years after Lisa's disappearance, Alan went on a work trip to another city with 2 of his coworkers. While he was there, he got a call from the police. A detective introduced himself and said he'd just been assigned to Lisa's case. He told Alan he believed Lisa was no longer alive and that they had a warrant to search his house again. In fact, they were already on their way. At that moment, Alan was sitting with his coworkers, and, according to them, his face went completely pale during the call. After hanging up, he asked for a cigarette and said he needed to talk to them. Alan said that 2 years earlier, he and Lisa had gotten into yet another argument. He couldn't even remember what started it, only that it escalated quickly. According to him, Lisa grabbed a kitchen knife and started threatening him. She allegedly said she could send him to the hospital, then call the cops and claim he attacked her first, and he'd end up in prison. Alan claimed that what happened next was a blur. Somehow, he managed to grab the knife from her, then pushed her to the floor and started choking her. When he realized she was dead, panic set in. He didn't know what to do, but, in the end, he decided to bury her body underneath the house and make it look like she had simply left. After finishing his story, Alan turned to one of his co-workers for advice. He knew this man had gone through something somewhat similar in the past. The coworker had told Alan that he once crashed his car while driving drunk, and his friend who was in the car with him died. To avoid taking the blame, he had moved his friend's body into the driver's seat. So now, Alan was looking to him for guidance. He started thinking through his options. He considered running away, or trying to quickly hire a good lawyer who might be able to challenge the search warrant. At one point, he even floated the idea of going back to Calgary and burning the house down. But then he corrected himself, saying that a simple fire wouldn't be enough to destroy the evidence. He'd have to blow the whole place up. In the end, he realized he probably didn't have enough time to pull off any of those plans and decided that running was his best shot. His coworkers supported this idea, and Alan started thinking about where he could go. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for. He wouldn't get the chance to carry out any of his plans. You see, that phone call from the detective wasn't just a heads-up about a search warrant. In reality, it was the final step in a long, carefully planned police operation that had been in the works for over a year, all aimed at getting Alan to confess. Back in 2013, the province of Alberta had updated its laws regarding missing persons, giving law enforcement more tools to conduct investigations. Around that time, Lisa's case was handed off to a different department, and they immediately put those new tools to use. One of their first moves was digging deeper into the phone activity tied to the voicemail Lisa had left her mom. What they discovered was that the call came from a cheap, prepaid phone that had only been active for about a month after Lisa disappeared. During that time, it was used to make just 5 calls, 1 to Lisa's mom and 4 to Alan. The problem was, Alan had never once mentioned those calls to the police. What made things even more suspicious was the location of the phone activity. According to data from the cell provider, all 5 calls were made using a cell tower located near Lisa and Alan's home. And, considering Lisa was supposedly long gone by then, that detail raised some serious red flags. That's when investigators started digging deeper into Alan's background. They pulled his financial records, and what they found was pretty disturbing. On the day Lisa disappeared, Alan had made a series of highly suspicious purchases: a large plastic tub, bleach, rubber gloves, cement, a big bucket, wooden boards, and cat litter. The last item stood out the most. Alan was severely allergic to cats, so there was no reason for him to be buying litter. Altogether, the purchases painted a grim picture. It looked like Alan had been preparing to get rid of a body. As for the phone Lisa supposedly used, detectives uncovered another clue: a purchase made with Alan's bank card at Walmart. The store had been selling the exact same model of prepaid phone used to make those 5 mysterious calls. But even with all of this, investigators still didn't have enough solid evidence to arrest Alan. They needed one of 2 things: either Lisa's body or a confession. So, they came up with a bold plan: an undercover operation designed to infiltrate Alan's life. It was given the codename Roar. The first step was to send in an undercover female officer. She accidentally bumped into Alan's car, which led to a casual conversation and, over time, a friendly connection. A little while later, she introduced him to another undercover officer, a man posing as someone about to open a new car dealership. He offered Alan a job, and the 2 quickly became friends. To keep up the illusion, police even made sure the dealership was set up and operating so Alan would have no reason to suspect anything. Police brought in several more undercover officers to join the operation, placing them at the same dealership to build trust with Alan. Over time, they all became part of his daily life. Even the woman who often babysat his kids, the girlfriend of his supposed coworker, turned out to be an undercover cop. As the months passed, Alan began to trust them. That's when detectives decided it was time to move into the final phase of the operation. They set up a fake work trip involving Alan and 2 of the undercover officers who had been posing as his colleagues. During that trip, the lead detective planned to call Alan and tell him they were about to search his house, and that they believed Lisa's body was hidden there. The goal was simple: catch Alan off guard, make him panic, and hopefully get him to confess to the people he now saw as friends. And the plan worked almost perfectly. Both undercover officers who were traveling with Alan were wearing hidden recording devices, and they captured his full confession on tape. Shortly after Alan confessed to the undercover officers, he was arrested and brought back to Calgary. Meanwhile, investigators headed to his house to carry out the search. It's worth noting that police had actually searched the property 2 years earlier, including the basement, but nothing had seemed out of place at the time. This time, however, the detectives had a clearer idea of what Alan might have done with Lisa's body, thanks to the list of suspicious purchases. So, they combed through the basement much more carefully. In one corner, they spotted a strange, cemented-over platform. It looked out of place, and its height matched exactly the wooden board Alan had bought 2 years earlier. Officers began taking the structure apart, and it didn't take long before they uncovered a hidden space underneath. Inside was a large plastic tub filled with salt and cat litter. And, sure enough, inside that tub was the body of Lisa Mitchell. Even though Lisa's body had been hidden for 2 full years, Alan's attempt to preserve and conceal it ended up working against him. The way he stored the remains actually helped preserve them well enough for the medical examiner to determine a cause of death. Just as Alan had said in his confession, it was strangulation. And while police now had everything they needed to formally charge him, they also uncovered something else. When they went through Alan's computer, They found a series of internet searches made shortly after Lisa's death. He had been looking up how different materials and conditions affect the rate of decomposition. As for the emails Lisa supposedly sent to her mom during the first month she was missing, those were also traced back to Alan's computer. Even more disturbing, detectives discovered that Alan had secretly installed spyware on Lisa's phone. It let him not only listen in on her calls, but also record them. That's how he got the audio clip he later used in the voicemail to her mom. This revelation suggested that the murder may have been premeditated, directly contradicting what Alan had told the undercover officers during his confession. Still, proving that Alan had planned the murder in advance was nearly impossible. In the end, prosecutors agreed to reduce the charge to second-degree murder, which carried a lighter sentence. Alan's lawyer also advised him to take the deal and plead guilty. It was the best way to avoid facing a first-degree murder charge. But even then, Alan insisted he acted in self-defense. He claimed he had been a victim of domestic abuse for years, saying that Lisa had physically assaulted him on multiple occasions. Prosecutors, on the other hand, argued that Alan had planned the murder in advance and then spent years trying to cover it up. In the end, the judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence to convict Alan of second-degree murder. Instead, he was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to just 7 years in prison. Prosecutors immediately filed an appeal, and the court sided with them. Alan's sentence was reviewed and extended, but only by 3 more years, bringing his total to 10. Lisa's family and friends were outraged, not just by the light sentence, but even more so when Alan was granted early release after serving just 5 years. However, he quickly violated the terms of his parole and was sent back to prison, where he remained until 2022, when he was officially released. So, while the punishment may have seemed shockingly lenient, the case still marked a rare and remarkable win for law enforcement. For an entire year, a team of undercover officers became part of Alan's everyday life, earning his trust and slowly guiding him into a carefully planned trap, where he finally gave up the dark secret he'd been hiding for years. It's also worth mentioning that after Alan's arrest, Lisa's children were placed in the care of her mother, and they've been living with her ever since. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a girl who went home from Sunday school on her bike and vanished without a trace. The police and hundreds of volunteers quickly joined the search, but they couldn't find her. Sometime later, detectives finally got a breakthrough in a quite unexpected way, but it was just the beginning, and none of them were prepared for what happened next. Sarah Ann Wood was born on March 4, 1981 in New York. She grew up in a religious family. Her father was a pastor in a small town in the middle of the state. From a young age, Sarah, along with her older sister and brother, attended services at her father's church and went to Sunday school. She enjoyed dancing, loved poetry, and was a member of her school's cheerleading team. Sarah also loved riding her bike and often used it to get to her father's church. It was less than a mile from her home, and Sarah regularly rode there for services, Sunday school, or just to help her father with something. On August 18, 1993, when she was 12, Sarah, as usual, rode her bike to church for Sunday school. The classes were conducted by other church members while her father stayed home. Her parents expected Sarah to return in the afternoon, right after the classes. But, as time passed and she didn't come back, they began to worry. After waiting a little longer, they headed to the church, thinking Sarah might have stayed behind with other kids, but she wasn't there. The Sunday school teachers said that she had left on her bike right after classes. They also mentioned that she took with her a few books, some colorful folders, and a small display board. Her parents grew even more concerned because the ride home from church should have only taken a few minutes, and it was unlikely Sarah would have gone anywhere else with all those items. Moreover, she always stopped by to ask for permission if she wanted to go somewhere else. Her parents followed the route to the church, asking neighbors if anyone had seen their daughter. Since it was a small town and Sarah's father was well known through the church, dozens of people quickly joined the search. They soon found a witness who had seen Sarah riding towards her house around 2:30 p.m. She was spotted just a few hundred yards from her home, which made her parents even more anxious. They were almost certain something bad had happened to Sarah and decided to contact the police. The local police department immediately began the search, deploying dozens of officers. The sheriff also asked the fire department for assistance, and they joined the effort. News of Sarah's disappearance quickly spread throughout the area, bringing in dozens of volunteers. In just the first few hours, several hundred people were already involved in the search. The police focused on the route from the church to Sarah's home, scouring the fields and woods on both sides of the road. They soon found the first alarming clue. Just a few yards into the woods, they discovered Sarah's bike leaning against a tree. The police focused on that area and soon found the items Sarah had taken from Sunday school, hidden under a bush. These discoveries led investigators to a grim conclusion. It was likely that Sarah had been abducted. They assumed that an unknown assailant might have dragged her from the road into the woods, left her belongings there, and then taken her away by car. The police department threw all its resources into the search, while Sarah's relatives, who couldn't sit still and wait, began printing flyers with information about her disappearance. With the assistance of dozens of volunteers, they distributed these flyers not only in their town, but also in neighboring cities. Despite all the efforts, the first day of the search ended with no results. Police and volunteers combed the area within several miles of the road until nightfall, but, unfortunately, they didn't find any new clues. The search continued the next morning with even more people joining in. The state police also got involved, focusing on finding a possible suspect. Investigators questioned all the town's residents, hoping someone might have seen a stranger or a vehicle that could be connected to Sarah's disappearance. Sarah's parents organized an improvised headquarters staffed by dozens of volunteers. They printed and distributed flyers while also trying to find witnesses or any leads that may bring them closer to finding Sarah. Local media soon began covering the case, and in the following days, news of Sarah's disappearance spread nationwide. The police received more than 1,000 tips and thoroughly checked each one, but they repeatedly hit dead ends. Concerned residents helped the parents raise a substantial $150,000 reward for any information about Sarah's whereabouts, but, unfortunately, this also led nowhere. The active phase of the search continued for about a week, but eventually, the police concluded that they were unlikely to find any valuable leads in the area. They continued to work on the case, now focusing on finding a potential suspect. Detectives checked local residents, convicted criminals from neighboring towns, but nothing yielded results. Sarah's disappearance was featured on 2 popular national television shows, leading to a new wave of tips. Her parents also made regular appeals to the public throughout the media, asking for any information about their daughter's whereabouts, but her fate remained unknown. This continued for nearly 6 months, until something quite unexpected happened. On the morning of January 7, 1994, a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca left her home in a small town in Massachusetts and started walking to school. While walking down a deserted street, she noticed a man walking alongside her. He said something, but Rebecca didn't hear him because she was wearing headphones. When she took them off, the man pulled out a gun and told her that if she did everything he said, he wouldn't hurt her. He grabbed her by the jacket and they continued walking in the same direction. Rebecca was afraid to scream or try to run, but she understood that even if she complied, the man might still kill her. Soon, she realized the man was leading her to a car and quickly came up with a plan. She pretended to have an asthma attack and struggled to breathe. Rebecca sat down on the ground and the man let go of her jacket. He grabbed the edge of her backpack while she continued to act as if she was suffocating, and at the right moment, she slipped out of the backpack straps and ran away from the kidnapper. A few hundred yards away, Rebecca spotted several adults. She ran to them and said that someone had just tried to abduct her. Meanwhile, the kidnapper got into his car and drove off, taking Rebecca's backpack with him. One of the witnesses decided to follow him in his own car. He tailed the kidnapper for a few minutes, then stopped at the nearest gas station and called the police. The witness provided them with a partial license plate number of the kidnapper's car and its model, while Rebecca described his appearance. The police began searching for the vehicle, checking databases for matching cars. They also sent out information to nearby towns, and, on that same evening, their efforts paid off. An officer driving through a small town a few miles away suddenly noticed a vehicle matching the description. He stopped and knocked on the door of the house where it was parked. There were several people inside, and the officer asked who owned the pickup truck. The vehicle's owner explained that he hadn't used it in a long time because he had lost his sight. Said of his neighbor, 43-year-old Louis Lent, often used the truck. Louis was a handyman who helped the blind neighbor with various household chores in exchange for using the pickup. Louis said that the last time he drove the truck was the previous day, and he hadn't used it since. Despite this, the officer asked him to come to the station for questioning, and Louis agreed. The man continued to insist that he hadn't used the pickup that day. He denied any involvement in the attempted abduction, claiming that he was a devout Christian who spent most of his free time at church, and would never do something like that. While Louis was at the station, the police took his photograph and showed it to Rebecca and other witnesses in a photo lineup mixed with pictures of other men. They all unanimously identified Louis as the kidnapper. Rebecca, who had seen him up close since he was less than a yard away from her, stated she had no doubt that he was the one who tried to abduct her. Investigators quickly obtained a warrant to search Louis's house and the vehicles. In the pickup truck owned by his neighbor, they made quite a disturbing discovery. There was a small bag containing duct tape, a knife, children's sunglasses, and candy. In the van, which belonged to Louis and was also parked near their house, police found a gun and Rebecca's backpack. Inside the house, investigators found something even more startling: a large, secret room dug out beneath the house, which was still under construction. With all this evidence, the police arrested Louis for the attempted abduction. Initially, he continued to insist on his innocence, but pretty soon decided to confess to everything. He admitted that he traveled to Rebecca's town looking for a victim, bringing along his so-called kidnapping bag that he always kept in his car. Louis then explained the purpose of the secret room he was digging under his house, and his story shocked even the police. He revealed that he planned to turn it into a full-fledged bunker where he intended to hold kidnapped victims. Louis said he aimed to abduct 11 girls, aged 12 to 17, to satisfy his horrific fantasies. He added that until the room was finished, he didn't plan to keep his victims there long, intending to kill them within a few days. In Louis' house, the police also found a list of several names. Upon identifying these individuals, they realized all of them were children living not far from Louis' home. It appeared that Louis had been considering them as potential future victims once he completed the secret room. After his confession, Louis was placed in jail awaiting trial for attempted abduction. Investigators continued to visit him to gather some additional information, and during one of these visits, he unexpectedly confessed to another crime. Louis revealed that 4 years prior, in October 1990, he was working as a janitor at a movie theater in the same town where he later attempted to kidnap Rebecca. On the evening of October 22nd, he left work and saw 12-year-old James Bernardo riding his bike near the parking lot. Louis immediately decided to abduct him with the intent of assaulting him. There were no witnesses in the parking lot, and he had a bag with his kidnapping kit in the van, the same one that police later found during the search. Louis offered him $5 to help set up chairs in the movie theater, and James agreed. Louis led him to the empty theater where he tied him up. He then drove his van closer to the entrance, dragged the boy and his bike inside, and took him to his home. He left the boy there and drove to a nearby lake to get rid of the bike. After throwing it into the water, Louis returned home and attempted to assault the boy, but was unsuccessful, so he decided to dispose of the victim. He dragged him into his van and drove to a neighboring state, where he killed him and left the body in the forest. It was soon discovered by a hunter who reported it to the police. However, over the course of several years, detectives were unable to get closer to identifying the culprit. Now, comparing Louis' statement with the case materials, they found that he provided a vast amount of facts and details about this crime that perfectly matched reality. After Louis's confession, news about him spread quickly through the whole country. In just a few days, police realized they were dealing with a man who not only tried to abduct a girl and was building a secret bunker for other victims, but also confessed to a murder no one suspected him of. Investigators in New York who were searching for Sarah would also heard about Louis's case. They looked into the details of Rebecca's abduction attempt and requested more information about Lewis himself. Before that, profilers had created a profile of Sarah's potential abductor, and Lewis seemed to fit it quite well. The investigators decided to talk to him and went to the prison. During the interrogation, he mentioned that he often traveled to the neighboring state because he had close relatives living there. Lewis also said that sometimes during these trips, he drove through small towns looking for victims. And, on August 18, 1993, he noticed Sarah. According to him, she was walking along the road with her bike beside her. Lewis pulled up next to her, got out of the car, and used a gun to force her into the van. He tied her up, then dragged her belongings and bike a few yards off the road into the woods so they wouldn't be found too quickly. After that, he drove Sarah to the mountains hundreds of miles from her home. He stopped in a remote area by a large lake, where he assaulted and killed her. Lewis dug a hole and buried her body. He also mentioned that he wasn't sure if she had actually died or was just unconscious while he was doing that. But for some reason, Lewis refused to disclose the exact burial location. However, like with his other victim, he provided detectives with a wealth of details, leaving no doubt that he was indeed responsible for this crime. Police began searching the area around the lake, involving hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and even the military. However, they faced an obvious problem. Given the enormous size of the lake, even with such an impressive search team, it was practically impossible to cover the entire area. Moreover, months had passed since the burial, and the location could have become overgrown with grass. After several weeks of searching, they failed to find either the body or any evidence. Nevertheless, detailed testimony with precise details of the abduction was enough to charge Lewis with the murders of both Sarah and 12-year-old James. In January 1995, Lewis was sentenced to 17 to 20 years in prison for the attempted abduction of Rebecca. The following June, the trial for James' murder began, and Lewis pleaded guilty before the judge. He also told his lawyer that he wanted to confess to Sarah's murder immediately, but when he entered the courtroom and saw her parents, he suddenly changed his mind. However, just 9 days later, when he was brought into an empty courtroom, he finally admitted his guilt. Despite this, he continued to refuse to disclose the burial site, despite desperate pleas from Sarah's parents. Eventually, the prosecution offered him a deal. In exchange for information about Sarah's whereabouts, they promised him that he would serve his sentence not in a federal prison, but in a state one, as Lewis wanted. He agreed and began working with investigators. Lewis pointed out a specific area near the lake and even drew a rough map. The police also wanted to take him along on the search, but his lawyer advised against it. The police organized extensive searches in this area, despite the snow and freezing temperatures. They used heavy equipment and the help of hundreds of volunteers, but all their efforts were in vain. They weren't able to find Sarah. Several months later, when autumn came, the police made another attempt, but once again, they were unsuccessful. Throughout this time, detectives tried to get more specific information from Lewis, but he refused to disclose the exact location or help the police find it. Eventually, the prosecution decided to revoke the deal, and on April 11, 1997, Lewis was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was the maximum sentence the judge could impose without the discovery of the body, but he added that if such evidence were available, he would have certainly handed down a death sentence. During the trial, Lewis' lawyer attempted to mitigate the punishment in all 3 cases. He did not dispute his client's guilt, but argued that Lewis suffered from an unidentified mental disorder. According to him, Lewis heard voices in his head and claimed to have contacted aliens, but experts found no evidence of any mental disease. They concluded that he was probably just pretending in an attempt to avoid serious punishment. After the verdict, detectives continued to visit Lewis in prison, hoping that he would finally reveal Sarah's burial site. He behaved quite strangely and gave the police different locations, often contradicting himself. Once, he stated that he was not ready to disclose the location because he had buried Sarah next to another victim and did not want anyone to find out who it is. Sarah's parents also visited Lewis in prison, begging him to tell them the burial site, but he continued to remain silent. Detectives were also considering Lewis's possible involvement in other unsolved cases. After he confessed to the abductions of Sarah and James, the police had almost no doubts that he had other victims. Almost immediately after his arrest, they learned about another attempted abduction he had made. Several years prior, Lewis had tried to grab a girl off the street, but her father intervened. They reported it to the police, but detectives couldn't find the perpetrator. Only after Lewis' photo appeared in the news did the girl and her father recognize him. Lewis was also suspected in 4 unsolved disappearances that occurred from 1985 to 1992. Investigators determined that he had the capability to commit all these crimes, but no evidence was found, and Lewis refused to confess. Despite this, his story didn't end there. Detectives continued to visit him after his sentencing, hoping he would reveal Sarah's whereabouts or confess to other crimes. However, this didn't happen until 2013, when Lewis suddenly decided to confess to another murder. He confessed that he is responsible for one of the crimes he was suspected of. According to him, on November 6, 1992, he abducted a 16-year-old teenager with developmental disabilities who was riding a bike to his grandmother's house. Lewis said he forced the boy into his van, then killed him and dumped his body in a lake. Investigators confirmed his involvement based on his detailed description of the events, but official charges in the case have not been filed against him to this day. Right now, Lewis is 73 years old, and he continues to serve his sentence for 2 murders and an attempted abduction. Sarah's parents still believe that someday they will convince him to reveal the burial site, or he will disclose this secret before his death. The family also continues the work of the center they initially opened to gather tips and distribute flyers. Over the years, they have expanded to assist in other missing children investigations, a commitment they uphold to this day. Primarily focused on distributing flyers, their efforts helped reunite 399 children with their families in 2017 alone. In memory of Sarah, her relatives also organize an annual bike ride. Initially attended by just a few people, over the years, the number of participants has grown steadily. Currently, several thousand people regularly participate in the event, also helping to raise significant funds to support efforts to find missing children. Police have no plans to give up the search for Sarah's burial site, regardless of Lewis's willingness to disclose this information. They intend to continue search operations in the areas he has indicated until they succeed in finding her. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.